Good evening, all. I'm Audrey Chapuis, Director of the Library. Welcome to Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. Our speaker this evening is Paul Richter, here to discuss his book, The Ambassadors. So now for a century, the American Library has been charged with furthering cross-cultural understanding and creating opportunities for free inquiry and open debate. And these talks are really one of the most important ways that we further our mission. So thank you for being here and for supporting the American Library. We have a special guest to introduce our speaker this evening. Damon Austin initially connected us with Paul Richter, and Damon is the American Library Association's representative on our Board of Trustees. He was appointed to that role in 2018. He is currently the Director of Library and Media Services for DeMatha Catholic High School in Maryland. And in his diverse library experience, he has served the profession by his work and leadership in school, academic research, government sector, and public library institutions. Thank you for being with us tonight, Damon, and of course for connecting us with Paul. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Catherine. And of course, thank you everyone for attending. As the American Library Association's appointed member to the Board of Trustees of the American Library in Paris, I have the privilege of identifying notable authors who are willing to share their work and their experience with an informed global community via our Evening with an Author series. And so tonight's presenter, Paul Richter, has been writing about foreign affairs and national security for 3 decades. As a Washington-based correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, he traveled with presidents and secretaries of state and has reported from 60 countries. After assignments at the White House and the Pentagon, he began covering the State Department at the time of the 9/11 attacks and continued through the end of the Obama administration. His book, The Ambassadors, was a 2020 winner of the American Academy of Diplomacy's Douglas Dillon Award for Books of Distinction on the Practice of American Diplomacy. He is also the principal author of a 1983 book entitled California and the American Tax Revolt. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Paul Richter.
Thank you, Damon. It's great to be here tonight with the library. I'm such a fan. The library has done so much to bring books to the international audience. My book is about a special subcategory of American diplomats, those who are sent as ambassadors to countries struggling with war or civil upheaval. Most ambassadors, of course, go to stable countries to carry out policies that have been worked out in advance. But these ambassadors were sent into chaotic situations where officials in Washington hadn't really figured out what to do. And these ambassadors often ended up with unusual influence. Sometimes they were more like British colonial viceroys than typical modern ambassadors. They had to help put together new governments, broker political deals between warring blocs, and sometimes even help lead military operations. They often had to risk their lives to do their job. Over the past 2 decades, the State Department regularly sent out diplomats on missions like these because of America's many challenges in the greater Middle East. The Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan wars, the Arab Spring revolutions, and counterterrorism campaigns. It's been a frustrating period, of course, for these US efforts. The presidents in this period never really figured out the puzzle of the Middle East. But through their struggles, these diplomats offered steady, insightful advice and helped find the way. I focused on 4 career ambassadors. You may have heard of some of them. Ryan Crocker, who was a 6-time US ambassador in the region. Ann Patterson, who was ambassador to Pakistan and Egypt during this period. Robert Ford, who was ambassador to Syria and was the number 2 in Iraq. And Chris Stevens, who was ambassador to Libya and was killed in the terrible terrorist attack on Benghazi in 2012. I decided to do this book because I noticed during my 15 years covering the State Department for the LA Times that the leadership of the department kept sending the members of a small circle of diplomats to these tough places. I thought their story would be fascinating and that it could give some insight into what the US has done right and done wrong during this period. There are different kinds of career diplomats. Some like to stay in Washington and work on the great diplomatic puzzles like the search for Arab-Israeli peace. Some like to immerse themselves in learning exotic foreign cultures. And there's a small group that's drawn to the toughest places where there is civil crisis or war. The group that I wrote about is in that category. They became specialists in countries on the edge. They were like emergency room doctors. They seemed most at home when they were dealing with the most gruesome injuries. You could call them the best people for the worst places. To give you an example of what they did, Ryan Crocker was sent to Afghanistan as US chief of mission in early 2002, when the US and local allies had ousted the Taliban government that had been supporting al-Qaeda. The interim head of the Afghan government, Hamid Karzai, had been a school teacher and he'd been a press aide to an opposition politician, but he had no experience creating a country. Crocker helped him pick a cabinet, helped him try to settle disputes between rival warlords, and negotiated secretly with the Iranians over how to set a path for the new state. Washington didn't give Crocker any special instructions on how to do all this. Before he left the US, they told him, go figure something out. Crocker would meet Karzai before dawn at the Afghan presidential palace, an ornate 19th century fortress, and they would try to plan their next step. Crocker said the question that kept coming up in their conversations was, what the hell do we do next? Karzai was grateful for American help, and he always wanted more of it, but often he didn't know what to do next, understandably. And for periods, he did nothing at all. Sometimes Crocker would have to prod him a bit to get him going. A former CIA officer I talked to who was there at the time said Crocker sometimes would have to give him a kick. There was a steady stream of Afghans coming through Karzai's office asking for money or jobs in the new government. Karzai tended to want to please every visitor. Sometimes he would give jobs to people who were too closely tied to the Taliban or to the local drug lords. And then Crocker would have to tell Karzai to go back and tell these people that they couldn't have the job. In 2009, Pakistan's leading politicians were in an angry confrontation, and it looked like the government might fall to a military coup. But many of the country's leaders, including the chief of army staff, party heads, and even some pro-Taliban Islamist politicians, decided they needed to appeal to the US ambassador, Ann Patterson, to use her influence with the Pakistani president, Asif Zardari, to get him to settle for a compromise. She agreed to do that, and soon Zardari had stepped back from the brink. In 2011, when a civil war began in Syria, the Obama administration had its hands full of crises in Egypt, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere. State Department officials told Robert Ford, who had just arrived in Damascus as the new ambassador, our hands are full. You're going to have to tell us what approach to take. So Ford decided he was going to openly challenge Syrian President Bashar Assad over Assad's attacks on unarmed protesters. Ford got global attention appearing at protests and speaking out against the government's repression. This angered the Assad government, and they sent a mob of plainclothes policemen to attack the US embassy in Damascus. But it turned out to be one of the few moments in the war when the US approach won praise from abroad and from both parties in the US Congress. Ford came to Syria after serving 5 tours in Iraq following the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. In his first posting there, he was made the one-man occupation government of the central province of Najaf. He had to try to organize a regional government, restart the local economy, and hold at bay the Islamist militias that were trying to take control of the region. Ford sped around, sometimes with no bodyguards, and at one point he was taken hostage by a Shia militia. One of Ford's biggest threats was from a renegade militia leader named Muqtada al-Sadr. Sadr wanted the Americans out immediately, and he was trying to set up a competing government. His militiamen were kidnapping and killing Iraqis they considered rivals. Ford told top American officials in Baghdad that they needed to arrest Sadr before all the US efforts in Najaf were undone. But a number of top US officials didn't want to do that. They were afraid it was going to just create more resistance to the US occupation. So twice Sadr was stopped at military checkpoints, and both times he was set free over Ford's objection. Sadr's militia, which was known as Jaish al-Mahdi, just kept getting bigger and bigger and more of a threat to the US troops and the Iraqi government troops. By the end of the Bush years, it was killing more US troops than al-Qaeda. Sadr's people knew that Ford wanted them stopped. By the end of his tour, he was hearing from Iraqi contacts that his name had been put on Sadr's list for assassination. Years later, Paul Bremer, who was the top American in the occupation government in 2003, acknowledged in an oral history that Ford had been right. The US authorities, he said, should have arrested Sadr when they had a chance. When civil war broke out in Libya in the spring of 2011, Chris Stevens was chosen to sneak into the country under a NATO bombardment to serve as US envoy to the rebels. He spent 6 months dodging bullets and missiles, trying to keep Washington informed on what the rebels were doing. He agreed to go back as ambassador in 2012, when the threat from Islamist militias was making the country ever more dangerous for Americans. General David Petraeus, who was CIA director at that period, said Stevens was our eyes and our ears. There's been a big argument in Washington in the last few years about the value of career diplomats like these. Former President Trump and his allies had the view that they were trying to undermine the Trump agenda and take foreign policy in a different direction. He called them the Deep State Department. He took career diplomats out of high-ranking jobs and gave the post to political appointees, including some of his top fundraisers. Now the new president, Joe Biden, is vowing to return top jobs to some of the best career diplomats and to start refilling the ranks of the State Department. Many groups, of course, have a hand in guiding American foreign policy. In the last few decades, the military and the intelligence agencies have had a big role. Recent presidents have expanded the National Security Council staff in the White House. It swelled to over 300 people in the Obama years. Presidents also like to bring in political allies who don't have much foreign policy experience, and sometimes academics who are on temporary assignment. But the career diplomats who are experts in their regions have continued to make a big contribution. In his 1995 book, In Retrospect, the former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara said that the US had avoided a lot of mistakes in the early Cold War years because it had good advice on the Soviet Union from career diplomats like George Kennan, Tommy Thompson, and Chip Bolin, who had spent years learning about Russia. McNamara said that officials in Washington didn't have good advice from regional specialists on Vietnam in the 1960s, and the result was disaster. In the countries that I write about, there was often not a bright line between political and military matters. The US generals who were involved in the Middle East got involved at times in local politics, and the diplomats sometimes got drawn into overseeing the war making. In Afghanistan in 2002, Crocker had to take charge of getting a column of tanks to a big battle that was shaping up in a remote valley. A local warlord was blocking passage of the tanks, fearing that rivals from the north were going to use these weapons to seize part of his land. After a night of tense negotiations, Crocker finally got the warlord to let the tanks through, but only by warning him that if he didn't, US tanks and fighter planes might come after him. During Ann Patterson's posting in Pakistan, Washington was ramping up its big drone war on militants in the country's northwest corner. In an unusual move, Patterson was given authority to challenge planned drone strikes if she thought there were a mistake. She didn't often do that, but occasionally she intervened if she thought a strike might cause civilian casualties or disrupt Pakistani society. Of course, a lot of what these ambassadors did was what any ambassador does. Top priority was always making sure that the US had a workable relationship with local leaders, even if the two governments were at odds on the big issues. The US-Pakistani relationship was one of the most difficult in the world at the time, in part because leaders in Islamabad wanted American support, but opposed the US military campaign in Afghanistan and were trying to undermine it. Patterson set out to build a relationship with the Pakistani president as soon as she got there. And soon she was advising him on everything from defense, national finance, domestic politics, and sometimes even his personal problems. Ryan Crocker built a respectful relationship with Afghan President Karzai during his first tour in 2002. 9 years later, when Crocker returned to Afghanistan as ambassador, Karzai had become fed up with US officials and wasn't speaking to almost any of them. But Crocker was still on good terms with him, and he was able to resume the conversation right away. One of the most remarkable parts of Crocker's career was his repeated secret, indirect negotiations with General Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian military mastermind. The US and Iran had been arch enemies, of course, since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But there were also times when the two countries had interests in common and wanted to figure out whether there were ways to cooperate. So Crocker's first negotiations of this kind were in 2001, when the Bush administration held talks with Iranian officials to discuss how they were going to take on the Taliban government and organize a new government. The Iranian officials who met with Crocker in Europe, the US, and Afghanistan were directed by Soleimani. The second time was in 2003, when Crocker was working in Baghdad, trying to help pick Iraqis to become part of a new interim government. Crocker thought this new government was going to work only if Iran had some buy-in. So he had word sent to the Iranians and, of course, to Soleimani about who they were thinking of picking to see if Soleimani had any objections. Crocker had another round of these negotiations in 2008 when a US team led by Crocker met with Iranian representatives in Baghdad to discuss the increasingly bloody battles between US troops and Iranian-backed militias. Crocker learned that the Iranian delegation had been getting minute-to-minute orders from Soleimani in Tehran. Through all of this, Crocker and Soleimani never met face-to-face, but in each case, the general was the one in Iran calling the shots. These four ambassadors were very different people. Crocker was the son of an Air Force bomber pilot who knew that fairly early in his career that he was drawn to the action. He liked it much better than sitting in the State Department building arguing with colleagues about the fine points of diplomacy. he really realized that he was suited for this kind of work in 1983 when he was present for the bombing of the US embassy in Beirut by the Lebanese group Hezbollah. They set off a 2,000-pound truck bomb that killed 63 people. Crocker spent the next couple of days helping pull bodies out of the crushed building. Robert Ford and Chris Stevens had both been Peace Corps volunteers in Morocco before they joined the Foreign Service. They were fascinated by the ways of the Arab world and hoped to spend their careers slowly learning its secrets. They had no particular desire to work in war zones, but when they were thrust into it, ultimately, they adjusted and they found they could handle it and even enjoyed it much of the time. Chris Stevens felt strongly that he didn't want to work in Iraq. He considered the invasion a terrible blunder and didn't want to work in a situation where the diplomats were subordinate to the big US military teams that had the lead role. Robert Ford, who was then based in Baghdad, tried twice to recruit Stevens to come work in Iraq, but Stevens turned him down both times, although there was a good chance that doing that might destroy his promising diplomatic career. It wasn't, of course, a question of physical courage. 5 years later, as ambassador to Libya, Stevens insisted on taking a trip to dangerous Benghazi against the advice of his security officials and lost his life. At the end of his career, Ford was offered an ambassadorship in a quiet country in East Asia. Ford's wife, Allison, who was also a Foreign Service officer, told him she didn't see him doing that kind of work. "That's not you at all," she told him. Ford agreed and declined the offer. Ann Patterson studied economics in college and graduate school and didn't expect to spend her career in the most dangerous frontline settings, but she ended up accepting a series of assignments like this. She put in a bid to be ambassador to Colombia in 2000 at the height of the drug-financed insurgency, when only 2 other people in the Foreign Service even wanted to put in a bid for the job. She went on to lead the huge Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, then signed on to be the ambassador to Pakistan when the country was at the top of Washington's worries. She moved from that tough post to Egypt, becoming ambassador in 2011 when the country was in upheaval after the ouster of the longtime leader Hosni Mubarak. These ambassadors were always in physical danger, but that wasn't the only cause of their stress. When Patterson took over as ambassador to Egypt, the regime began a campaign to denounce her, hoping it was going to undermine the US effort to force reform on Egypt. Patterson was denounced by protesters in the streets and accused in the Egyptian media of scheming to help the leading Islamist party win power. When President Obama heard that Persian Gulf Emirates had joined in this campaign against Patterson, he called up Mohammed bin Zayed, Crown Prince of Dubai, to complain. Patterson told an Obama aide that she appreciated Obama's intervention, but it was unnecessary. "I'm a big girl," she told him. "I can deal with it." As Foreign Service officers, of course, these diplomats had to carry out the approach that Washington wanted, even if they didn't think it was a good idea. That's the way the job works. But all 4 of the ambassadors that I wrote about agonized at times over what the Bush and Obama administrations were doing in the Middle East. Ryan Crocker was one of the leading internal critics of the US invasion of Iraq before it happened. But he set those feelings aside after the invasion and served twice in Iraq afterwards, including as the ambassador from 2007 to 2009, to try to make the policy work. Robert Ford was deeply unhappy that the Obama administration didn't want to do more to support the Syrian rebels as the war there expanded in 2011 and later. After being the public spokesman for the administration's Syria policy for 3 years, he decided he could no longer advocate for it and resigned from the Foreign Service in 2014. These ambassadors were all disappointed in the outcome of US efforts in the region over this period. Like most career diplomats, they are foreign policy traditionalists. They think that President Bush was over-aggressive with the Iraq invasion and that President Obama went too far in the other direction when he tried to scale back US engagement in the Middle East. They believe we overreached in our efforts to shape Iraq and Afghanistan, yet they are internationalists and believe the US should be present in crisis zones, if on a more limited scale. In their view, Americans need to understand that these foreign policy challenges take time and require slow, sustained efforts. Ryan Crocker's view was that Americans have tended to believe that they can accomplish anything overseas and charge off quickly on foreign adventures. Then they quickly lose interest and want to withdraw and come home. He thinks that Americans need to be more careful getting into these engagements and also more circumspect about getting out of them. Now, of course, the US has been winding down the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And after the enormous death toll and expense of those wars, many Americans and Europeans have concluded that those kinds of interventions should be avoided at all costs. But I think there will continue to be a need for the kind of diplomacy I'm writing about here, what's sometimes called expeditionary diplomacy. The number of unstable countries around the world is not declining, but increasing. And the troubles of countries in chaos has a way of spilling across its borders to other countries. The US and Europe wanted to keep a distance from the Syrian civil war, but refugees from the war and refugees from Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan made their way to Europe with some destabilizing results. The new Biden administration is pledging to help stabilize countries in Central America, in part because their refugees are lining up again at the US-Mexican border. It's inevitable that leading nations will feel a need to try to stabilize countries in chaos using diplomatic engagement, investment, political reform, and sometimes a measure of military force. And despite what's become the conventional wisdom, Western efforts at nation building aren't always doomed. Since the Cold War, interventions have helped bring more peaceful conditions to a number of places, including the Balkans, East Timor, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Mozambique. Former Ambassador Jim Dobbins, who specialized in trying to stabilize chaotic countries, pointed out that all 4 of the presidents before Donald Trump insisted they'd never get involved in nation building overseas, but then they all were drawn into it. Dobbins told me that presidents never like the term nation building, but they're sort of condemned to the activity. Thanks, I'll take a few questions now.
Great, thank you so much for your talk, Paul. And this wonderful overview of the book. Yes, I'll invite the audience again to submit any questions that you might have via the chat feature, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time that remains. Okay, so I've got one coming in here. All right, this is sort of a fun one. Okay, thanks to Mr. Richter for this comprehensive talk full of human detail. My question is more of a pop culture nature. Is there a movie or a song you can recommend that deals with the nature of foreign diplomacy? The ones that come to mind are the 2013 film Quai d'Orsay, it's called The French Minister in English, about Dominique de Villepin, as well as the Warren Zevon song, The Envoy, and the Randy Newman song, Political Science. So I don't know if pop culture is your realm of expertise, Paul, but do you have any ideas for this attendee?
Boy, well, there's certainly a lot of good documentaries on about all of this stuff. I mean, my my fixation this year has been this French series, which is not new to Parisians, of course, Le Bureau, which I think is did such a great job of talking about the spy business. They filmed on location, and I thought it was it's not directly involved with what I wrote about here, but it took up some of the problems of some of these countries that I wrote about.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So why not a more forceful role for such career diplomats to governments as policies are being developed, informing policy with expertise rather than serving uninformed policies?
That's a good question. The way the system works is that everybody, and especially the regional specialists, are supposed to be allowed to make whatever case they want beforehand. And then once the policy is decided, they have to follow whatever policy the president has chosen. And they do, people in the ranks, the people in the Near Eastern Bureau of the State Department do get a chance to write at great length to try to make their cases. Well, to give you an example of that, before the Iraq War, Crocker and two other diplomats wrote a long memo that's become famous. It was called the Perfect Storm Memo, about all the things that could go wrong in Iraq. And they listed just dozens of possible bad consequences, and many of them came true, others did not. But the memo was sent up the line and only went so far. Colin Powell didn't pass it on to the White House, apparently. I don't know whether he was discouraged and thought that they'd already decided to invade Iraq, or what his reason was, but that's what sometimes happens. It's been decided at a higher level.
All right. So we have an audience member who's wondering if you can contrast the timing between ambassador timelines versus military timelines in these volatile regions.
Well, I mean, the real contrast is between, I would say, the political timelines from Washington and those of the diplomats in the military. I mean, I think in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been, just to talk about this question of whether we should still have troops in Afghanistan, I would say that the military and the diplomats involved in this are more or less on the same wavelength, and that happens a lot. But the political pressures build immediately as soon as any kind of military engagement begins. Public interest in it wanes immediately, and it's really important to the presidents to have that public support. And so I think that's where the real rub takes place.
Right. Okay, we have another fun one here. At least I think it's a fun one. Someone is wondering if you've been to all of the countries that you write about in the book.
Yes, I have. I was actually in Libya. That's one of the more, everybody's been to Iraq and Afghanistan, but Libya was a slightly more unusual place to go in these years, because the US had been at odds with Gaddafi for so long during most of his rule there. But in 2008, I went on a trip to Condi Rice to meet Gaddafi. This was at the point where the US and the Libyans were kind of groping toward a better relationship. And so Gaddafi brought rice into his private kitchen for dinner and gave her a locket. And she was a little bit alarmed by his romantic interest in her. And the Secret Service were a bit alarmed by it too. And she decided, she wrote in her book that after that encounter with Gaddafi, she decided it was really a good thing that the Libyans were giving up their nuclear weapons program. I've spent time in Afghanistan. I've been there several times. I was on a trip there once with Richard Holbrooke, where we went around the country. This was 2009. Was it I think it was 2009 when the country was having an election, and Hamid Karzai was angry with the Americans over this. But we went to all four corners of the country, and it was really an enlightening trip.
That's interesting you mentioned Richard Holbrooke. We actually hosted George Packer last year, who had written that wonderful, very thick biography of him. So there may be some people in the audience who read that work and are familiar with him as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful book. I love his descriptions of Holbrooke, and Holbrooke was such a great character to write about because he was so colorful and personally, as a person, he was impossible. I went to his memorial service in Washington, and even at the memorial service, all the American officials were kind of, saying admiring things about Richard, but also kind of, reminiscing about his unusual traits as well.
Yeah, we got all those inside stories as well. All right, so I'll move on to another question here, which is, are there regions or countries where the US diplomatic efforts are not as strong as it should be? Are we focusing our efforts on the current sort of hot topics or hot regions at the expense of nascent, unstable regions?
Yeah. Well, Latin America, I would say, has always been the area, or at least in the post-World War II area, where the U.S. involvement has been somewhat less, and there's been a lot going on, but it's less seen as a threat to American security, and as a result, it gets less attention. Almost every president comes in, and every Secretary of State comes in and announce they're going to give new attention to Latin America, and they mostly don't do that. I suspect that Biden is going to give it more attention because the border issues are really important right now.
All right, so the next one. What are the advantages and disadvantages of being a career diplomat versus a political appointee?
For political appointees, it's really a plum post. Generally, a lot of prominent people love to be politically appointed ambassadors, especially to places like Western Europe and the Caribbean, and they can, it's the life of the ambassador can be just the seat of luxury. You have a lot of people waiting on you. You're running this fairly large staff that does whatever you want. Some ambassadors require that their staff rise when they come into the room. So it can be almost the life of, a minor aristocrat to have one of these postings. The career diplomats, like the people I write about, are more likely to be sent to all the tough places. When it's Iraq or in Afghanistan, and they're kind of trapped in their green zone and they don't get out a lot. This isn't the kind of job that a lot of political appointees want. There's there's also another class of people who are not career diplomats, but become very skilled diplomats. And there are a lot of those, some prominent people. Mike Mansfield is just one example. There are many people in this category, and they contribute a lot too, but they don't have they don't really have the role of a career diplomat.
All right, so this one's back to sort of some of the geographical, cultural, religious concerns. I'll just go ahead and read it. The region under discussion is composed of long-held tribal and religious enmities, and is characterized as tribal in operations, as long ago as Gertrude Bell's warning to her Foreign Office after World War I. Could the US not approach such regions with more sophisticated understanding of native cultures rather than imposing US visions of, quote, stability?
Yes, they could, and they should. And I mentioned Robert McNamara's quote in his book about the use of regional specialists. Sometimes the top policymakers get good advice on the regions and they follow it. But often when we get involved, it's because there's some security issue that presidents and American leaders are feeling, worried about. I mean, a lot of our blunders since World War II have been because the US was worried about Cold War issues, the advance of our adversaries. In the case of recent wars, of course, counterterrorism has been a big driver. And when there's, security worries involved, we don't often make the right choices. We don't often think about what people, what the nature and politics of these societies are. So it kind of complicates our making the right choices.
All right, great. We'll go through just a few more questions here. So what I'm seeing now is, was the recently deceased former Secretary of State George Shultz a businessman or economist who got what diplomacy is? Maybe just some commentary on this figure if you have any. Yes,
You may have noticed that Shultz, there was an outpouring of praise for Shultz from all sorts of people, foreign policy experts from both Democratic and Republican administrations, because Shultz did make a lot of good choices, had a lot of insight. The State Department, he was one of the secretaries of state who tried to really use all the people and resources of the State Department. And he was beloved for that among the staff there. Some secretaries of state, like Madeleine Albright and Jim Baker, tend to kind of focus on a few top issues and have less involvement with the State Department staff. But Shultz was an amazing guy. He was one of only 2 Americans to have held 4 cabinet posts. He'd been, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Budget Director, and the Labor Department Secretary as well. And he was the Secretary of State for a really long stretch of the Reagan years. So all that kind of testifies to his insight and staying power.
Great. So we've got a pretty open-ended one for anyone in the audience, maybe this person herself as well. She's writing, if a young person is interested in a foreign service career, what area or areas of study and or early work do you suggest?
Well, I would suggest study as a generalist. You're going to need to know a lot about the American government structure, foreign government structure, geography, and just a lot of general knowledge. The Foreign Service exam, which I think is passed by only something like 3% of those who take it, is the kind of the ultimate smarty pants test, where you need to know a lot of things about currency issues, big economic issues, a lot about a little bit about the rivers of Africa. I mean, it's a general, it's a test of general knowledge. So that would be the way that you'd want to go. If you're thinking of a foreign service career, I would also suggest talking to some people in the business about what who the most satisfied foreign service officers are, and what kind of talents you want to have to go into that line of work.
Great, thank you for that advice. Now we're moving on to another personal question again. So, of the many countries you've reported from in the regions, could you imagine yourself tolerating working for an extended stay in any of them?
I can actually imagine myself having an extended stay in any of them, because they were all really interesting. One of the places that most interested me in travel was Indonesia, because it's so huge, and I think Americans are singularly ignorant about all the different parts of Indonesia. Really, I guess it's the biggest Muslim country, and a fascinating place.
Great. So I'm going to summarize this next one. We have somebody who's speaking to the experience of her daughter. Basically, that the daughter has had some disappointing experiences with U.S. embassy staff in Tel Aviv, not necessarily speaking Arabic, not having such developed thoughts on Palestine. What would you say to that, I guess, and how will such staff develop three-dimensional experience?
Oh, let's see. So her issue is that she thinks that the embassy staff aren't as knowledgeable as they should be about.
Right, don't have the training and kind of the sensitivity that the region would require.
Yeah, I don't know that that's a function of what's happened in the Trump years, but of course, for a long time there was a kind of a separate part of the U.S. embassy staff in Israel, kind of looked after the Palestinian side of issues, even had their own office. I don't know whether that's still the case, whether the Trump administration reduced the number of people there. I think the problem may be reaching the best people to talk to on this, because if you're not able to find the most knowledgeable and sensitive people in the organization, that could be a problem.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's it as far as the questions that I'm seeing come in, but I did want to ask one important question of my own to wrap up. Where can we find the book if we'd like to buy a copy?
You can find it anywhere on the usual booksellers online, which is, Amazon, Target, there's a lot of them that you can find online. And I want to recommend, there's the paperback version, which is slightly less expensive. I did an update of that late last year, so it's more up to date, and I would recommend that version.
Perfect, thank you. And Damon is very helpfully letting us know the book is also available on Audible, so it looks like we can listen to it as well.
The guy who read the book for the Audible version was on Seinfeld once as an actor. So.
Well, that's a fun fact. Yeah, thank you for leaving us with that. Well, it's really been a pleasure to host you, Paul Richter. Thank you for giving this book talk, and I wish you continued success with the book, of course. Thank you also, Damon, for connecting us and for your lovely introduction. I'll just wrap up with a couple words about the library, and then I also wanted to leave you with a short video prepared by our sponsors, Grow at Annenberg, who sponsors this Evenings with an Author program. You can feel free to leave at any point, especially once that video gets going. There won't be anything on the other side, but do stick around if you'd like to enjoy it. So just a reminder that the American Library in Paris is a nonprofit organization, and we do welcome donations. If you'd like to support the library, I invite you to click on that link that went out in the same email as the Zoom link. You'll find it sort of just above that in the body of the email. Traditionally, we welcome about 10 euros per person per event. And that, that was when events were in person, but also for virtual events, we'd be very glad to have your support. And thank you, of course, to anyone in the audience who is a member or a donor. If you'd like to learn more about the library and stick around and see what we're doing for future events, I invite you to visit our homepage and check out what we have on offer for the rest of February and into March. So thank you again, Paul and Damon, before I start this video. And it was lovely to have everybody here. Thank you also to the audience for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome to the American Library in Paris. Bienvenue à la Bibliothèque américaine à Paris.
Well, the greatest thing about the library for me is the way it brings people together.
The library is not just this quiet place where people sit in a corner and read.
It's an anchor. Libraries are not just places with books, they're places for community, they're places to meet, to study.
It's a cross-cultural touchstone, an anchor for a global community of users from over 60 different countries, and a venue where literature lovers can come together, meet, and exchange meaningfully. The American Library in Paris is really one of the most significant lasting legacies of the Library War Service. During World War I, the American Library Association and the Library of Congress coordinated a nationwide effort to send millions of books to soldiers serving abroad. The library has been tied to literary Paris for as long as we've been in existence. Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway wrote for our newsletter. Henry Miller was a frequent patron. He even wrote us asking us if we had books about Zen Buddhism. It's something that we're incredibly proud of. From our inception, the library has been extremely committed to protecting our patrons' access to information and to books. During World War II, librarians convened a clandestine lending service to our Jewish patrons. During the Red Scare, librarians barred the doors to censors, and we launched a curbside lending service during the pandemic to ensure that our readers had access to books.
From the beginning of our history, the library has been offering story hours for children. And now we have about 250 programs a year for children and teens.
There are so many cultural programs. They're really at the heart of what the library does, and they're just as important as the books on our shelves.
We have community-led book groups. We have author-led writing workshops. We have a visiting fellowship program for rising authors and a writer-in-residence program for more established authors. We also have a series called Evenings with an Author.
Thanks to all of you, American Library of Paris patrons and supporters, for coming out tonight. It's really wonderful to be back here.
My favorite program is Evenings with an Author. I've participated many times. Everyone from Ta-Nehisi Coates to Alice Kaplan has spoken here. There's a real sense of exchange and dialogue and fun and communion at the American Library.
Project 100 is our centennial campaign. Thanks to our community as well as leadership gifts from our Board of Trustees, we've been able to expand the Children's and Teens Library, add an additional group study room, and refresh the collections.
I think the American Library in Paris has an incredibly bright future.
It's really an open place that welcomes dialogue. It's a place where American and French culture mix.
You feel like part of something. From the time I arrived here, I just had a sense of being part of a multicultural community that loves books.
I like this library for the people. The people, to me, are what make the library great.
It honestly makes me feel hopeful about humanity when I meet the children who come here. They're incredibly thoughtful about the world, they're interested, they're exchanging, they're communicating, and I feel like if our future is made of readers, then we have a bright future.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. See you next time.